Welcome to Building a Better Budget, How to Create and Stick to a Realistic Wedding Budget. Now, I actually can't see a chat here, so if I'm hopeful that we're all good, and we'll connect face to face again once I get through all the information, and we'll do the Q&A then. So thank you so much for joining me here. As I said, building a budget is a stressor that I hear from a lot of people, and I'm here to help you sort through things and to answer your questions and to make sure that you are starting off your wedding planning on a solid foundation because, you know, goodness knows there are so many things to think about when you're planning a wedding for the first time. And if you are kind of navigating these uncharted waters without a solid foundation, AKA a great budget, solid guest list, and some really well thought out priorities, it's going to be pretty challenging for you. So my goal here today is to make sure that you get all of those strategies to help you get your feet under you and hopefully alleviate some of that stress. The plan to become a budget ninja, I'm going to just give you a quick introduction to myself in case you don't know me, in case you haven't been following along, and I'll tell you where you can follow along in just a little bit. We're going to obviously start with why budgeting is important. You're a grown-up. I'm not going to harp on this, but we'll talk about why it's important. Some mistakes that I see couples make that I hopefully can help prevent you from making because they just increase that stress. We'll talk about how to figure out what's realistic because having never planned a wedding before, you probably have no idea what an actual realistic wedding budget is. We'll talk about how to allocate your funds, the things that people forget. I will, of course, give you some tips for saving money, and then we'll talk a little bit about additional help if you still need it at that point. So this is me. You'll notice that I have a glass of wine in my hand in this picture. That is a fairly common sight. I do love some good wine. I am keeping it to water tonight so that I can hopefully use words that make sense. But I definitely enjoy a good glass of wine. So if you ever want to join in on that, I'm definitely up for a meeting and a chat about a wedding and a glass of wine. I own Unmistakably You Boutique Wedding Coordination here in London, Ontario, Canada. We are a boutique service that caters to busy professionals who are looking to have a really personal and unique wedding. And we know that, you know, there are so many cookie cutter services out there, and what we really love is to work with people who want to infuse their personalities into their wedding and who want to have a unique, really personal day. So I launched Unmistakably You about 11 years ago. We have been planning weddings in person since then. But before that, I actually am a musician by training. I have my bachelor and my master's of music. I have actually a trombone performance degree, which, in case you're wondering, is not a particularly useful degree in most cases. But I do own a trombone. I don't get to play nearly as much as I would like to anymore. But I did move on from there to get my Bachelor of Education, which is part of the reason why I'm so passionate about teaching and education and helping you to plan an amazing wedding, because I know that a lot of you don't have the tools necessarily coming into wedding planning from scratch. I'm also a certified member of the Wedding Planners Institute of Canada, and that's what I've been doing for the last 10 years. I have been working at this since 2008 with an amazingly awesome team of fantastic girls. I know that some of you who are on the call know some of the girls. They're wonderful and compassionate and caring and thoughtful and kind, and I just can't sing their praises enough. So I'm incredibly blessed to be able to share the business of weddings with my incredible team. That also allows us to work with more couples in person here in London. So that's a real blessing for us. And I launched the Wedding Academy in 2019, just last year, because as I say, so many people come to me and they say, I just am so confused about what to do to plan this wedding and how to set a budget, and I just don't know what I'm doing. And my answer is, why should you know what you're doing? You're not a wedding planner. You don't do this professionally. Most of you have probably never done this before. And why should you expect that you have all the answers and you know all the ins and outs? So that's where I come in. My job as a wedding educator is to help you to have the tools to plan the wedding of your dreams without all of the stress that comes from having to reinvent the wheel at every stage. So that's me, and I look forward to getting to know you as well. Now, first off, why is budgeting important? Well, so you don't look like this lovely bride here. Um, as you know, if you're at all if you've gotten into the wedding planning, it can be very, very tense, very stressful. You can feel very helpless, very frustrated. And my goal is always to help prevent that by setting you up for success with a realistic and a workable budget from the beginning. And this is important because it takes away that element of uncertainty from your planning. It gives you an idea of where you're going, where you're comfortable, and you're not just blindly booking things saying, oh yeah, I think we can afford that. That's something that I see a lot of people doing, and I feel stressed for them just because that uncertainty of where are we going to end up at the end of this is palpable in a lot of cases, and people are just really very, very worried and just anxious when I see them a lot of times. Being financially responsible, of course. As I said, you're a grown-up. I don't need to tell you that you should try to be as responsible with your money as possible. We recognize that a lot of you are not only planning a wedding, you're also buying a house or having a child or getting a puppy. And we want to make sure that you have the funds to do that as well. And we don't want you starting your marriage in uncomfortable debt, because that just puts more tension into what's already a new situation. And that's one thing that we hope to help you prevent so that you can move forward in this new relationship on a more stable footing. And finally, it's good for your sanity, it's good for your soul, it's good for your heart to know that you have everything well in hand when it comes to your budget. So those are the things that we want you to always keep in the back of your mind as you're going through the process of setting up a budget. You may find, if you're not a numbers person, you may find the process a little bit tedious or a little bit daunting, but I encourage you to stick with it and really set yourself up on the right foot, just for the purposes of future sanity. And trust me when I say that. Some mistakes that I often see couples make when they come in and meet with me in my showroom. Commonly, I see couples who haven't set a budget before they've started booking things. I've seen people who don't really have a good sense of their priorities, and also couples who have gotten to the end of their planning and all of a sudden they're hit with huge amounts of extra costs that they had forgotten to budget for. So when it comes to not setting a budget first, I often see couples come in and they say, oh, we got this great venue and we really love it. And then we put down our deposit and started booking some other vendors, and all of a sudden our budget is completely out of control. And at that point, they've already paid their deposit on their venue or their photographer or whatever it is that they got really excited and went out and booked, and then all of a sudden realized they're now committed to this vendor or this venue, and it doesn't really fit into a comfortable space for them. I also often see couples who don't really have a good sense of their priorities, or they're not necessarily on the same page when it comes to what's important to them. I always kind of liken this to buying a house, and I also often liken my job to that of a realtor. You wouldn't, in most cases, try to buy a house by yourself. In most cases, you would hire a professional to do that, and that's my job as a professional wedding planner, is to navigate you through the process and show you the ins and outs that you might not be familiar with, much like the process of hiring a realtor. Now, if you were buying a house, if you've ever done that, you probably started out by sitting down with your partner and making a list of priorities. You know, big backyard, ensuite bathroom, 3 bedrooms, big basement, whatever it is, you will have a list of must-haves. And then again, if you've ever been through the process, you know that it doesn't always go that way. You know, you might see a house with a great, beautiful backyard and 3 bedrooms and a wonderful basement, but it doesn't have an ensuite. And so you have to decide, can we live with that? Is there the potential to put in an ensuite later on? So you weigh the pros and cons of each different element of the house, much like you have to weigh the pros and cons of each different element of your wedding. So I always advise you, and I talk a lot about this when I teach my wedding planning kickstart course, You really need to figure out what's important to you, which vendors are going to become the highest priority, which vendors and venues are likely to sort of be a budget stretch, and what you can cut back on. So be really conscious of having priorities and knowing what you can live without. You do get what you pay for. So in most cases, I see couples come in and say, oh, I want this photographer and this videographer and this caterer and this florist, and they want the Cadillac in every category. But of course, as you know, that usually doesn't work unless your budget is unlimited. So do keep in mind that you get what you pay for. So allocate more towards those priority elements and figure out where you can scale back in other areas. And then finally, a mistake that a lot of couples make is just that they don't know what they don't know. And that's not necessarily a mistake, it's just a fact that if you haven't planned a wedding before, and if you're not working with a really comprehensive spreadsheet or budget, you're in many cases not going to allocate all of those little miscellaneous things that will come to bite you at the end of your planning, which of course is the 2 weeks before your wedding, which is the last time you want to have more stress on your plate. But then all of these things tend to kind of creep up on you and they snowball, and all of a sudden you're $5,000 or $10,000 or $15,000 over budget. So those miscellaneous details are things that you will hopefully have. I'm going to definitely go over them today. You will hopefully have them in your budget spreadsheet right from the beginning so that you can allocate for those things. And otherwise, you'll find that you get to the end of the plans and, oh, you need a license and you need this permit, and oh, we forgot to add in any gratuities for our vendors. So make sure that you do allocate those things right off the bat. Now, this number is a big number. I'm going to just let that sink in for a second. Hopefully didn't make you fall off your chair, but that $29,450 is the average cost of a Canadian wedding actually from 2018, so 2 years ago. We tend to only go upwards, so we're a little bit north of that right now. Now that, of course, is an average, so it certainly doesn't mean that you have to spend $29,000. And it certainly, if you're not in Canada, it varies country to country, region to region. And it also varies greatly depending on your guest count, your priorities, and the style of wedding that you are hoping to have. So don't turn off the recording right now and storm off and pour yourself a drink because you can't afford a $29,000 wedding. We can certainly find lots of creative ways, and we do all the time with our clients, to keep them on a more comfortable budget for them. Now, if you're comfortable allocating $29,000 or 39 or 49 or 59,000, by all means, the sky is the limit. This is just an average. But just so that we're going into this knowing where things are common in Canada, keeping that in the back of your mind as we move through. Now, I always advocate for a couple to have a really, really thorough discussion about what's realistic for them. And I always call this the I can get married for $5,000, right? Conversation. And that was me when I planned my wedding. Now, mind you, that was a million years ago, and I wasn't a wedding planner yet. I became a wedding planner after I got married because I really liked the process. I thought I was going to spend $5,000, and I very quickly found out that while $5,000 is a lot of money, in a lot of cases, it doesn't necessarily go very far. Now, that's not to say you can't get married for $5,000. Again, it very much depends on the style of wedding you're planning, your ability to prioritize and to compromise, and your style of wedding. So I don't mean to say, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm absolutely not saying that you can't get married for $5,000. I'm saying that in a lot of cases, people come into a wedding planning process with unrealistic expectations. And so my goal is to teach you what's realistic for you. It's always really important to me that I deal with my clients on a personal level where I'm planning their wedding. I'm not planning my wedding. I've been there, I've done that. I need to do what's right for my clients, and what's right for my clients is keeping them on track financially. So there are basically 3 ways that you can determine what's realistic for you. And the first would be to start off with a guest count estimate. And I would advise you, there are basically 4 things that you need to do at the beginning of your planning. And a guest count that's realistic is one of them for sure. You need to sit down and write down how many people you're expecting. Ask your parents if they're expecting to invite guests. And once you've got that number, don't pull it out of thin air. Once you've got an actual concrete number, you can estimate based on what a realistic cost for those people to feed and give them drink for the evening is in your area. Now, you may not know that without doing a little bit of research. I can tell you that, again, it depends on the style of wedding and the venue and the caterer. But if you're looking at a banquet hall or a golf course or a hotel here in London, you're most likely going to start with a plated meal and an open bar at around $120 to $150 per person. Now you can scale that way back if you're having a cocktails only wedding that's on private property. There are other items to take into consideration when you get married on private property, but it's a good place to start, to just assume your biggest cost is always going to be food and beverage. And if you can figure out what the food and beverage are for the number of guests that you're having, then you can multiply that by 0.35, because that's typically about 35% of your budget, and that will give you your total budget. So just for the sake of estimates here, if you were having 100 guests at $100 a piece, and you multiply that by 0.35, it's going to give you about $27,000, I believe. Let's hope my math is right on that. So there we go. We're at that fairly average price for a wedding in Canada in this day and age. So that's the first way you can determine what's reasonable. The second way is to really sit down with your partner and discuss where you are comfortable in terms of your financial contributions. Maybe one of you has been saving for this day for years and you already have a nice little nest egg. Maybe you haven't saved any money for a wedding. Maybe you're depending on your parents for contributions, or maybe you have a rich Aunt Betty who's going to contribute. Oh, I hope you have a rich Aunt Betty. But figure out how much money you actually realistically have at your disposal. Again, don't pull numbers out of thin air. Sit down, figure out your monthly expenses, figure out how long it is before the wedding, how much can you comfortably save between now and then, and set that as your budget. And let me tell you that if that budget is $5,000, you can get married for $5,000. You just need to make some compromises and some choices, and it can happen. So figure out what a comfortable number is and set that as your budget. The third way I would suggest that you can figure out what's realistic for you in your area is to research your average area costs. And there are a few places that I would suggest that you can do this. First is to ask any of your friends or family members who've been married recently in your area. Just ask them for round numbers. You're not asking for a bank statement, but ask them approximately what you can expect to spend if you're having the style of wedding that's similar to what they were having. You can also go to local Facebook groups. If you haven't already discovered it, there are in every area Facebook swap and sell groups and Facebook wedding boards, and you can get into those wedding groups and ask what the average costs are in your area for the services that you're looking for. And then the final way that you can figure out average costs in your area is to figure out which vendors are of priority to you and find out what their pricing is among a sort of sample of the industry. So let's say that photography is a really important priority in your wedding. So you're going to reach out to a couple of photographers who you like the look of, find out what their average pricing is, and then you're going to multiply that by the percentage of the budget that you've allocated to photography. So if you can figure out your core vendors and then work sort of backwards from there, that'll also give you a sense of what's realistic for you and in your area. Okay. Now, again, as I say, what is realistic for you is going to depend on a lot of different factors. One of them is parent versus personal contribution. These days, a lot of couples do pay for their own weddings entirely themselves. If your parents are contributing, that's great. It might be an uncomfortable conversation to say, hey, mom, dad, how much money are you planning on giving me? But it's a conversation that I would really advise you to have at the beginning of your planning process, because if you're depending on your parents for $10,000 and they only come through with $2,000 in the end, that's a substantial chunk of money that you now have to make up the difference on. So make sure that you have those conversations with your parents early on. Of course, the length of your engagement, if you are putting aside a little bit of money month to month, then a longer engagement is going to allow you obviously to save more money. You'll want to add that to your existing savings if you have any. I know that some people have been dreaming of this day since, you know, their first paper route and have been putting away money since then. And some people just have had other priorities. So if there are existing savings, absolutely apply those to the additional money that you'll be saving over your engagement. And think about how much more you can realistically save. Again, you may need to make some sacrifices here. If you're hoping to have a wedding that you're trying to save more money for, maybe it's time to cancel your cable or to, you know, cut down on the wine that you drink. That's a personal one that always comes back at me. So think about how much it's realistic to put aside every month. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of our couples are not just planning a wedding, they're also buying a house, or they are getting a dog, or they're starting their family. So think about other financial commitments that you have on the horizon and account for that as well. Think about the size of your guest list. What's realistic? What can you pare down? The more guests you have, the quicker it drives up your budget. And then think about the desired structure of your day. There's a vast difference in cost between a really formal, you know, traditional structure where it's ceremony, cocktails, dinner, dance, where you have open bar all day, where you have a 3-course plated meal in a very swanky venue. There's a vast difference between that and something that you perhaps host in your backyard with a more affordable caterer and you've purchased your own alcohol. Now, of course, there are pros and cons both ways. And this is something else that I teach about in my online courses, is the different kinds of structures to a day and the pros and cons of all of them. Obviously, with that backyard wedding, there are a lot more moving pieces that you are going to have to juggle. With a, you know, swanky wedding venue, there are house staff who do everything for you. Those are decisions that you need to make with your partner and that will play into your overall budget in the end. Also your desired theme and the aesthetic of your day. So that sort of goes hand in hand with that elegant, swanky, fancy wedding. If you're going all out like that, as opposed to keeping it a little bit more simple and DIY, that will also have a big impact on your budget. Now, quick little non-precise bar graph here. This is a really, really generic idea of how much you might expect to spend in each of these categories. And I've lumped them together. I'll break them out for you in just a minute. But just so that you can see, as I said before, the absolute lion's share of your budget is going to go into reception. Now, there are a million little expenses within reception, but the biggest two are going to be food and beverage. So that, hands down, is the biggest expense, followed by your ceremony, attire and rings, photo and video, transportation, some miscellaneous costs in there, flowers, decor and rental, stationery and bakery, and followed by entertainment, which is a little bit ironic because, to be honest, the things that your guests are going to remember most about your wedding are the first thing on the list, the reception. If your food is bad, they will remember. And the last thing on the list, which is arguably the smallest cost, the entertainment. But trust me, if your DJ or your band is not playing music that your crowd is liking, they will remember that as well. And it will really color the experience of your day for both you and your guests. So again, I always come back to remember that you get what you pay for. Now, to break this out for you, as I said, these are very generic estimates of cost. If you are having a hall, a banquet hall or a hotel wedding, you're going to probably have to allocate a little bit more than 35% to your reception. If you're having a backyard, private property, or barn wedding, you're probably going to have to take a little bit out of reception and allocate that elsewhere. Often it's going to go into rentals, especially if you are creating a venue in your backyard. If you don't have a structure and you're having to rent a tent and tables and chairs. More about that later, but just know that these numbers are not magic. They are meant to be, to a degree, one size fits all. So take this with a grain of salt and know that you are going to have to tweak things and move things around. And when I do a budget consultation with a client, I always make sure that we're talking about every element of every category so that I can get a really thorough grasp on what their priorities are and how they want their wedding to look and feel, so that we can move money around. A budget is a very organic, very dynamic document that will change and it will morph, and you will end up taking money from here and putting it over here, and you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. But the ultimate goal is that you're not going over budget in every single category and saying, oh, I'll pull it from somewhere else later, because you're going to run out of somewhere else to pull it from very quickly. So just for general ideas, reception is going to constitute about 35 to 50% probably of your budget. And that's going to include everything that you see here, from your reception site fee through all of your food. Don't forget to include your hors d'oeuvres and your late night meal. In most cases, if you're serving alcohol, you do want to have that late night meal coming out just to soak up some of that alcohol. I've always got gratuities on my list. Depending on your region, it may or may not be convention for your banquet servers, your caterer, your hall to add a gratuity automatically onto your bill. But in most cases, it is expected from a caterer or from a banquet hall or from a hotel. And in many cases, it will be built right into your bill. So make sure that you know if that's there. And if it's not there, it's likely expected. This is something that tipping, gratuities, it's a very gray area in most cases, but I would say that it's less gray in terms of your catering, your food service. In most cases, there is, here in Ontario, it's a 15 to 18% gratuity typically, which adds up very, very quickly, especially if you've forgotten to allocate for that in your original budget. Your liquor and your beverages obviously go into your reception budget as well. There will be a vast difference here again if you're paying a hotel price of $6 or $7 a drink versus if you're purchasing your own alcohol. You'll have to have your own liquor license, but you're saving probably $4 to $5 per drink if you're purchasing that alcohol yourself. And some venues will allow you to bring in alcohol, some venues won't. So make sure that that's one question that you ask when you are investigating venues, is whether or not you are providing the alcohol and therefore supplying your own liquor license. Of course, smaller expenses like favors will come in here. You may be bringing in entertainment. Now here I'm not talking about your DJ or your band. I'm not talking about your main entertainment. I'm talking about things that you might be bringing in as, little spices here and there. Maybe you're bringing in a magician, or maybe you're bringing in, a live singer for your cocktail hour, or, maybe you've got some kind of dancers coming in. I did a really awesome Persian wedding a number of years ago with some Persian dancers. So that kind of thing is what I mean here by entertainment. And under decor, I don't mean your major decor. I'm not talking about your head table backdrop or your ceiling draping or whatever it is that you're doing. I'm talking about little items like guest book, memorial display, those kinds of things. And then miscellaneous expenses, like if there's a parking fee or a valet fee at your venue, if there's a coat check fee. Some couples choose to provide childcare. Some couples choose to have a childless wedding. It's totally up to you, but make sure that you account for those expenses if it's something that you are thinking of doing. Moving on to our next category, I've got ceremony, attire, and rings all together on that bar graph that I showed you, but ultimately they are separate expenses. Your ceremony tends to make up about 5% overall. And there you're looking at your ceremony site fee. Sometimes you won't have that if you're having a one-stop shop, if you've got your reception and your ceremony at the same location. But often there is a ceremony site fee which will cover the setup and tear down of chairs if there's staff to do that. So make sure that you're inquiring as to that. In some cases, it can be a bit of a hidden cost, even if you're at one venue where you're holding the whole event. Sometimes there is a ceremony setup fee, so you need to be aware of that and account for that as well. Of course, your officiant or your minister or your celebrant, whatever the terminology is in your area, that will go into this category. Chair rental and setup, if you're doing that separately. If you're bringing in any kind of altar, so an archway, a chuppah, a mandap, that kind of thing. If you have a ring bearer, pillow, flower girl basket, and then if you're doing any kind of a send-off, rose petals, rice, bubbles. Those are the typical things that I account for in a ceremony budget. Of course, you may have decor that is not mentioned here. In most cases, you'll have flowers as well, but I try to account for those in the floral budget. In the attire budget, I always kind of laugh when I talk about this with my couples. Now, this particular list is, it mentions a bride and a groom. Obviously, if you have two brides or two grooms, you're going to allocate things a little bit differently. But I always kind of laugh because the first 10 items are for the bride, and then there's one little line for the poor old groom. But that's kind of the way it is. So, of course, you've got your bridal gown. You'll want to allow for alterations, any undergarments or accessories, shoes, jewelry, that kind of thing. Don't forget about your hair and makeup. That I tend to put in the attire category as well. And additional spa services too. If you're having a manicure or a pedicure or a facial, please don't have a facial the week before your wedding. Do it more than a week before, just in case. If you're not one who gets regular facials and you don't know how your skin might react, please do that more than a week in advance. And then we get down to the groom's attire. So if he's having a suit or a tux, include his shoes, his shirt, his tie, all of his accoutrements in there as well. Now, if you've got two brides, you may want to up your attire budget if both are wearing a gown. Just allocate things that are appropriate for you and your situation. Rings get a shockingly small 3% of the budget, which, depending on what you're looking at, is often not enough. So this may be one of those categories where you need to infuse some money from elsewhere. In a lot of cases, I see couples for whom rings are not really a priority, and then in other cases, rings are the priority. So again, make this yours. Discuss your priorities with your partner, and if this budget needs to go up, then by all means, put that budget up. But don't forget to include things like engraving and extra insurance. If you need to get an additional rider on your home insurance policy, make sure you look into that as well. Photo and video are, in a lot of cases, a big priority for a lot of people. Perhaps in our area, more so photo than video, although I do hear a lot of couples say that one of their biggest regrets is not hiring a videographer. So do keep that in mind when you're having that priorities discussion with your partner. I typically allocate about 13% for this, and you'll want to make sure you know whether there's an additional cost for an engagement session, how many hours are included, whether the digital negatives and the prints are included or additional. How much is it to get an extra copy of the video, if that is an applicable price? Think also about post-wedding expenses like couples and parents' albums. You'll also want to ask about travel fees if your photographer or videographer are coming from somewhere other than your local area. And as always, account for a gratuity. Now you'll notice that I don't have gratuity in all categories. And a word about gratuity. I really believe that a gratuity should be earned, not expected. However, there are a couple of segments of the industry, as I mentioned, catering, also limos are always quoted, plus tax and tip. Those segments are definitely more overt about the gratuity being expected. In most other cases, a gratuity should be at your discretion. So a photographer is never going to expect a tip at the end of the day in our local area. Again, filter this through the lens of where you live, and by all means, get in some of those Facebook groups and ask some questions about this kind of thing. But typically, florists, decorators, bakers, photographers, DJs in most cases are certainly not going to expect a tip, although it would certainly be appreciated if one were given, because that would then express your gratitude for a job well done. There are lots of other ways to do that, though. In the wedding world, where most of your vendors are small businesses, word of mouth goes a really long way. So writing some great reviews would also be a great alternative to a monetary gratuity. Transportation, wedding planning, and miscellaneous, again, I've lumped in kind of together here. Transportation is one that personally I always feel is something easy to cut, but again, I have had my wedding. I don't want to push that on anyone else. If you've always dreamed of having a limo ride in your big white dress on your wedding day, then by all means, hire a limo. I tend to advocate for more affordable forms of transportation so that you can spend more money elsewhere, but that's my personal bias there. Wedding party transportation is something that usually you need to look after. Family transportation, not always. And guest transportation, it's becoming more popular to provide safe transportation for your guests, but it's certainly not a requirement. It's something that if you'd like to add in, you certainly can. Wedding planning, of course, I have to put this in here. I can't leave it out. Whether you're talking about full coordination or day of coordination is going to make a pretty big impact on that 2% of your budget. So a full coordination, obviously, when you're working with a planner from the very moment you get engaged until the very last second of your wedding day, they're holding your hand through everything, helping you with all of the decisions, navigating all of the communication and the contracts, and making sure that you don't miss deadlines. That, of course, is a much more substantial chunk of your budget than day of coordination, but still, it's something that I would advise you. I'm a little biased, but I would advise you to invest in if you can, just because it really is an investment in your sanity on your wedding day. You don't want anybody calling you saying, you know, someone dropped your cake or your DJ's running late or whatever it is. You don't want to solve those problems on the day of the wedding. So I would always, if it's within your financial means, advocate for a wedding planner, even if it's just for day of coordination. Okay, I'm off my soapbox. Miscellaneous expenses are some that people often don't think about. Parties, like your rehearsal dinner, or maybe a bridesmaid's luncheon or an engagement party. Those things typically would get included in your budget, but often are forgotten. Gifts to your wedding party are typical, very traditional, and often gifts from partner to partner, bride to groom or bride to bride. Not necessary, but often it's something that's done. So don't forget to account for that. Licenses and permits. Your marriage license, you definitely need in order to be legally married. Prices for marriage licenses vary from community to community. So feel free to shop around. If you want to go for a little drive someday to a smaller community, you might save 40 or 50 bucks on your wedding license. Marriage prep courses sometimes are expected, often if you're getting married by a religious body. Sometimes they're optional. I've definitely had couples who were not getting married in a church do a marriage prep course, and it can be really, really valuable. Liquor licenses, not a big expense, but something to allocate for. Extra insurance, if your venue requires it, or especially if you are hosting your own wedding on your own property or at, for instance, a barn venue that requires additional insurance. It's not a huge expense, but it is so, so worth it. I would just hate to ever see anything happen that you couldn't recover financially from. So don't forget to allocate for the insurance. Hotel rooms, again, not a huge expense, but when you take all of these not a huge expenses and add them together, it can very quickly start to escalate into the thousands. So do make sure that you plan for those right off the bat. Flowers, decor, and rentals. In terms of flowers, we've got personal flowers. Those are anything that you or your wedding party or your family are carrying or wearing. Bouquets, boutonnieres, corsages. Don't forget about the ceremony site. I always like to make things do double duty. So if you happen to have a beautiful floral spray on your arbor, perhaps it could be detached by your wedding planner and taken and draped across the front of your head table. I'm a big fan of taking your pew pew flowers if you've got something at the end of your aisle on your chairs or your pews, and repurposing those into cocktail hour centerpieces. So double duty is going to save you some money as well. Try and repurpose things wherever you can if you're moving from location to location, from ceremony to reception. And your reception flowers, that would be things like your centerpieces, any flowers on your head table or your backdrop, on your auxiliary tables like your card table, your guest book table. Decor, again, we've got ceremony decor, which may be non-floral. Maybe you're doing an aisle runner. Reception decor, again, if you're having a ceremony or a head table backdrop done, something like that. And miscellaneous decor, there are always things here and there like, you know, card boxes and you know, things like that that you need to account for as well. Rentals only get 3%, but as I said earlier, if you're having a backyard wedding where you're bringing in a tent and tables and chairs and washrooms and a generator and serving dishes and china and glassware and flatware and absolutely everything, you're going to have to take that and multiply it many times over. In fact, a lot of times rentals can add up to about $50 or more per person, depending on the choices that you make. So if you are looking at creating a venue in your backyard, don't fall into that trap of, oh, we'll just get married at home. It'll be so much more affordable because I won't have a venue fee to pay. No, you won't, but you will have all of those additional rental fees that really do add up very quickly, and it's more moving pieces to have to coordinate. So do think about that, and make sure that if you are doing a sort of DIY venue in a tent in your backyard, or if you've got a driving shed or a barn that you are going to convert into a wedding venue for the day, make sure that you really have a comprehensive list of everything that you're going to need to rent. In most cases, rental shops are really helpful where it comes to that. So sit down with someone in a party and tent rental company and they'll talk you through exactly what you need to rent. And I put garbage cans on there just because, I mean, it's something that nobody ever thinks about. So just to sort of drive home that fact that there are so many things if you're getting married in a tent that you need to make sure you allocate for right from the beginning. Stationery and bakery, of course, two of my favorites because cake is delicious and stationery is pretty. With regard to stationery, it actually, as you see, gets more of your budget than your rings do. And it seems silly until you work out how very much stationery you could do. Now, of course, there are workarounds. If stationery is not important to you, you can do your invitations online. You can certainly reduce your day of signage. There are lots of ways to cut down on this. But in general, you will want to think about save the dates if that's something you're doing, your actual invitations, and then your day of stationery. So everything from ceremony programs to signage, table numbers, place cards, and menus. Bakery, here in Ontario, if you're lucky enough to live here, not only is it a beautiful place to live, but your wedding cake is not taxable. It is the only element of your wedding on which you won't have to pay HST. Now, that is, of course, assuming that your vendors are full-time vendors and making more than $30,000 a year. If your vendor is not charging you HST, either they're hiding it and they're paying it themselves, or they're not over that threshold. So in some cases, you won't pay HST, often if your vendor is not a full-time photographer or a full-time baker, just so that you know. But cakes are not taxable in Ontario, and they are in most cases delicious, although I wouldn't necessarily suggest that you go crazy with cake if you also have dessert at your venue. So again, this is where priorities come in. If it's not important to you to have that cake cutting photo, maybe you could eliminate the cake entirely because your venue serves a mean creme brulee and you know your guests won't eat the cake if you purchase it anyway. If you do buy a cake and you serve it for late night food, I would anticipate that maybe only about 20% of your guests will actually eat it. So depending on your priorities, this could be another area where you save money. And finally, our last category is music. In most cases, you'll probably be incorporating some kind of music on your day, whether that's an actual dance or whether it's just ceremony music and backgrounds for cocktails if you're having a cocktail style reception. But music is something that you will want to either think a lot about or allocate about 4% of your budget too, because great music really plays a factor in whether people enjoy the day or not. It creates the experience for them. If you have a dud of a DJ and the dance floor is empty all night, guests will remember that for far longer than they will remember how beautiful the ranunculus in your bouquet looked. And I'm sorry to break it to you, but it's the experience, it's the food, it's the drink, and it's the music that guests will remember and will talk about forever. So this is a great place to invest, and I'm always an advocate for a professional musician, whether it's a band or whether it's a DJ, if you can possibly afford it, rather than making your own playlist. And that's a whole other subject for a whole other day. But if you can afford it, hire a professional and they will help to create that atmosphere of excitement and energy on your dance floor. All right, so that was a bit of a whirlwind. Of course, if you have questions about any of that, I'm happy to answer them. But I didn't want to leave you today without talking a little bit about the things that I often see couples forgetting and stressing out about at the end of their planning process. Taxes. This is something that varies from state to state, province to province, country to country. Make sure you remember to include your taxes when you're booking vendors. And it seems silly, but it's something that I often see people not account for. And here in Ontario, if you're looking at paying an additional 13% on top of everything, that's a substantial chunk of money. So work that into the budget from the get-go. Gratuities, as I've mentioned, make sure that if you are inclined to show your appreciation with gratuities, that you do work that into the budget. You don't want that to be a last-minute decision. Travel or overtime fees. I mentioned travel before, but overtime is something that you'll want to be conscious of as well. And this usually comes into play with photography and videography. So make sure when you're hiring those vendors that you are discussing, if we happen to be running late, what's it going to look like if we have to hire you for an extra hour to make sure that you're still there for our first dance? So have that discussion. Make sure that if you think your schedule might be tight, that you've also sort of at least planted that seed in your mind that that extra fee could be there. Alterations to attire. I often have brides literally fall off their chairs when they get their alteration bills. I usually budget somewhere around $500 for alterations, but it could be more and it could be less depending on, of course, what needs to be done to your dress. In terms of guys as well, if they're renting, the alterations are included, but if they're having a suit custom made or if they're having a suit altered, you'll have to put that into your budget as well. Licenses, permits, and insurance. These are things like liquor licenses if you're purchasing your own alcohol, your actual marriage license. In some cases, if you're getting married in a park, you'll need to have a permit to make sure that you actually can stake your claim to that space. Insurance, as I mentioned, is something that I would always advocate for unless you're getting married at a golf course or a hotel or a venue that has a ton of insurance in and of itself. If it's a smaller venue or your own property, absolutely make sure that you have some kind of an alcohol liability policy or a general liability policy that will cover your butt in the event, God forbid, anything happens. Music fees are something that a lot of people don't think about. Here in Ontario, we have SOCAN and ReSound, and those are the licensing fees that go to the actual musicians who make the music. So if you're having recorded music, in a lot of cases, you will have to pay that. Now, sometimes it's worked into your venue costs, so make sure you know whether that's additional or whether it's included. Marriage prep courses, as I mentioned, sometimes they're mandatory, sometimes they're optional, but it's something to think about. Gifts, again, I mentioned that earlier, so make sure that you think about gifts from you to the wedding party, which are very traditional. Typically, it is done in weddings in our area. In any case, it's nice to just give a little something to say thank you to a bridesmaid or a groomsman who has undoubtedly given up countless Saturdays to help you plan your stag and doe or to attend your bridal shower. They've purchased gifts for those showers. They've purchased gifts for your wedding. They may have had to take time off work or travel to get to your wedding. So make sure that you give them a little something to say thank you. Again, gifts to each other and gifts to your parents are something that I also see done often, and I would advise you to do something small if you can, just because as a parent now myself, I know I will be a blubbering mess if my daughter even just handwrites me a letter on her wedding day. But something, it doesn't have to be big, but something small to show your appreciation to those people should be included in your budget. Parties, engagement party, rehearsal dinner, as I said, bridesmaids meet and greet, or whatever it is that looks like, decide whether that should be included in your budget or not. And finally, I also mentioned hotel rooms earlier, so don't forget to put those in your spreadsheet somewhere. Money saving tips. Now, none of this is necessarily rocket science, but a lot of this is really going to help you to stay on budget, to sort of, save your sanity and to feel good about what you've put together at the end of the day. So paring down is kind of an obvious one. The fastest way to reduce your budget is to pare down your guest list. Now, it's an obvious one, but it's so, so difficult. And I don't mean to make light of this. It's absolutely so challenging to be able to say, no, I'm sorry, you're not coming to my wedding. So I would always advise you to set some kind of a guideline and stick to it. So whether that's no children, whether that's no plus ones unless you've been together for more than 6 months, whether it's no second cousins or first cousins once removed or whatever. So paring down your guest list is the fastest way, because feeding and providing drink for those guests is the lion's share of your budget. If you can pare that down, you will also reduce your budget fairly quickly. Your vision, again, not easy to necessarily give up, but prioritizing is super important. So if you can pare down your vision and maybe don't go for the Cadillac in every category, it will help your budget immensely. Doing some research is going to stand you in really good stead where your budget is concerned. If you just book the first vendor that you see in every category, you might be missing out on an equally amazing vendor that would have cost you far less money. So do your research, find vendors in multiple price ranges, and meet with them or talk to them on Zoom or Skype or whatever it is that we're doing when we can't see each other face to face. So make sure that you are comparing services and really determining what's worth it for you. You may find a photographer for $3,000, but you might find someone you like just as well for $2,000. So definitely do your research there. Don't be afraid to talk to vendors about your budget. The worst thing they can say is, I'm sorry, I can't do it for that. But if you see a vendor that you absolutely love and you are devastated at the thought that you might not be able to afford their services, sit down and say, you know what, I can't afford your $3,000 package, but I'm prepared to allocate $2,000 to this. What can you do for me? And you'd be surprised how creative vendors can be about what they can do to bump their services around. Maybe a photographer would be creative about your itinerary so that they're there for reduced hours and then therefore they can do it for less money. Your caterer might be able to suggest alternate food choices that would shave down your budget. So don't be afraid to have that conversation and to be really straightforward with your vendors about that. The worst thing they can say is no. And in that case, you just say, I'm really sorry, I would have loved to work with you, but I can't do it at this point, and you move on. I always advise that you can take advantage of wedding show and seasonal sales if you are shopping in the right season. Here in Southern Ontario, we tend to have wedding shows in January and in September, and oftentimes vendors offer some kind of a show special. So if you are walking around a show looking for inspiration, you'll often find photographers giving discounts or specials on tux rentals, or rental companies that are doing a promo on Chiavari chairs or something like that. So take advantage of those wedding show and seasonal sales and make sure that you're sort of doing your research, going to the shows that are, don't go to a luxury show if you're not looking for a luxury sort of a wedding, but do some research and do take advantage of those seasonal sales. There are also often sales around Valentine's Day and around Christmas because those are high engagement seasons as well. My final suggestion here is be smart and do it yourself while you're being smart. So consider vendors that provide more than one service. So for instance, a lot of photographers also do videography. And there's this kind of, I call it a get me through the door fee. So if you're hiring a new vendor to come out to your wedding, they're going to charge you X number of dollars just to get up and put their pants on. They're not going to leave their house unless it's worth their while. But if that photographer also has a videography team and they're already leaving their house and putting their pants on, then it's going to be more affordable for you because you're not paying every individual vendor that get me through the door fee. Another thing that I commonly see here are florists who are also decorators, or coordinators who are also decorators. We do decor as well, and we do it a lot more affordably because we are already there. If I'm hopping in my car in the morning and I'm going to throw in a head table backdrop, I'm still going to your venue with or without that head table backdrop. So it's a way that you can often work with with vendors that you love and get two services, not necessarily for the price of one, but for far less than you would pay two separate vendors. Now, DIY is a very big thing right now, and I absolutely understand the desire to put your own stamp on your own wedding. I just caution you to be really, really realistic about what you can and can't sort of commit to mentally and physically the week before your wedding. I often have couples who come in and they say, oh, I'm going to make my own cake and I'm going to bake cookies for a favor and I'm going to sew my own bridesmaids dresses and I'm going to do my own flowers from Costco. And I always say, okay, just be cautious that you're not overcommitting in the week before your wedding. And then I inevitably see them months down the road if they're a day of coordination client and they say, oh yeah, we hired a florist and we hired a baker. And ultimately that makes me feel better for them because I know that they won't be a ball of stress by the time they get to their wedding day. All right, so that pretty much wraps up the information that I have to give you today. I am, as I mentioned, really very passionate about helping you to navigate the ins and the outs of your wedding planning. And I'm also very aware that everybody has a different approach and different needs and a different style. So in terms of the education that we offer, I would like to just sort of take a second here and let you know about some of the things that we do to help out couples at all stages of their wedding planning, and to really work with a personality and a style of planning to give you the support that you need throughout the process. So at unmistakably.com/wedding academy, that's where we have our courses. And we start with the Ultimate Wedding Planning Workbook, which is directed at, I call the DIY goddess. This is really a comprehensive, complete workbook that is going to give you absolutely all of the information that you need to book all of the vendors that you possibly could be booking. It is a 162-page book that not only has helpful tips to think about as you're booking your photographer and as you're interviewing florists, but it also has all kinds of spreadsheets to keep your notes organized as you are progressing through your meetings, and it has questions to ask each of those vendors as well. So if you are bound and determined that you are going to have the experience of planning your wedding and you're going to love it and you're going to be prepared and you're all over it, this is a really good option for you. If you are the aesthetic visionary and you want to devote a lot of time and effort to making your wedding beautiful, we have the Wedding Decor Masterclass, which is a mini course that offers instruction about the principles of design and decor and how to pull together a really cohesive theme. And it does that through videos and downloadable worksheets and documents. So the Decor Masterclass is really aimed at someone who really wants to have that beautiful wow factor when their guests walk through the door, or alternately, aimed at someone who doesn't know how to create that wow factor and needs that information to be able to pull things together in a really cohesive way. And then finally, our flagship course is called Stressless Wedding Planning. And this is for people like me I don't know about you, but as I have progressed through my different phases of education, I've always been the classic overachiever. I'm the one who's in every club and on every team, and I have to have A pluses in all of my courses. And I started studying for my OAC biology exam like 6 months before the exam because I just had to have a 90. And that is what this course is all about. It is literally chock full of absolutely everything you will ever need to know about planning your wedding. It is hands down the most comprehensive course that's out there. It is a 12-month course, which is organized into modules that you can do one per month, and it will actually allow you to plan your wedding in real time in a year. So if you happen to be planning a wedding a year out, you could literally sit back and do one of these modules a month, and it's going to give you all of the information that you need to set up your budget, to book all of your vendors, to make sure that you don't miss anything, to stay on track and on task. It is literally everything that you need. There are hours and hours of videos. There are I don't even know how many downloads. I would hazard to say we're close to 100 downloads of fact sheets and budget worksheets and guest tracking worksheets and that kind of thing. So it is really very, very comprehensive and very thorough, and it comes with one-on-one support. So I know that the process of planning your wedding can be really daunting, and that's why when I set up this course, I do offer one-on-one support, because sometimes you just need a little coach to help you get through and to give you some personal advice. So these 3 courses are available on our website. I would love it if you go check them out. And I really love to help couples to figure out how to reduce their stress and to get to the wedding day still smiling and still in love, instead of being at each other's throats and so frustrated and just so done. I often have day of clients who come in and sit on my couch in my showroom 6 weeks before their wedding, and I say, "Oh, how are you doing? You're so close to the wedding." And they say, "Oh, we just want it to be over, or so done with this, I'm so stressed." And I never want anyone to get to that point. So that's why I created the Wedding Academy, to help educate you in what you don't know, having never planned a wedding before. So I would love it if you would check that out. And because you've stuck with me here, I do have a special offer on those courses for you. So if it's something that you think you're interested in, I'm happy to offer you 20% off. I kind of did this tongue in cheek with the 20% because it's 2020 and everybody was looking forward to 2020 and it was going to be such an awesome, exciting year. And then all of a sudden, 2020 happened, and it's not what people were expecting, that's for sure. So hopefully this helps to make your 2020 just a little better by taking 20% off of any course or product in our shop, which you can find at unmistakablyou.com/wedding academy. I would love to see you there. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer those. We'll talk more about that in just a second. Ongoing support is something that's really important to me, and I do really believe that wedding planning is something that requires community in many cases. You don't necessarily want to do it in isolation. So I do have a Facebook group called Wedding Planning Simplified. Feel free to check that out. It's totally free. There's great conversation and tips and tricks, and I go live every Sunday and answer questions. I also have a blog where I try to post helpful things. So if you don't see something on there that you're wondering about, shoot me a line and I will write a blog about it. And then I always want to make sure that I don't forget about good old-fashioned human contact. So as always, if you have any questions about anything, I'm an open book. I'm happy to chat. I love talking about weddings. It's what I live for. So don't hesitate to contact me either by email, amy@unmistakablyou.com, or my phone number's there as well. Always, always happy to talk.